everyone, and welcome to our webinar for this month here at WeatherWorks. It's called Empowering Your Business Model with Snowtistics. And in case you didn't know, Snowtistics is our snow and ice climatology report that we give to our clients. So I'm meteorologist Mike Mihalik. I'm a senior meteorologist, and I've been here for a bunch of years since 2008, and I've managed certified snowfall totals, publications, social marketing, all those things. But with me today to explain Snowtistics a little bit better is Sherilyn Patrick, and she's also a senior meteorologist. Sherilyn, why don't you introduce yourself for everybody real quick?
Yeah, so I've been with WeatherWorks since about 2014, going on 9 years actually this year in July. So like you said, I'm a senior meteorologist here. I am also director of past weather. So I manage both the forensic department for any kind of litigation and insurance matters that are weather related, as well as the data and statistical department that handles snowtistics and our climatology data. I've also moved on to being a technical project manager. So I'm actually working with a lot of software developers to help expand a lot of our products and make them more client facing and easy to access.
Great, all good stuff, Sherilyn. Glad to have you on the webinar here with us.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so in our webinar today, we're going to be talking about what is snow and ice climatology. We're also going to talk about how to use it in business and talk about our product for snow and ice climatology is called Snowtistics, which is when Sherilyn is going to fill us in on all the nitty-gritty details about how that works. But real quickly though, before we get on to the snow and ice climatologies, just remember that the SIMA Snow and Ice Symposium is coming up here in June 13th through 16th. So if you do have more questions about snowfall climatologies and snowtistics, please visit our booth at SIMA there, and we'll be glad to answer any question that you may have. So what is a snowfall climatology? So in the most basic terms, it's a historical snowfall data set spanning years, decades, or even a century. It can be used to determine snowfall averages and medians, snowfall extremes for a particular location, seasonal variability, event magnitudes and breakdowns. All those things are part of a snowfall climatology, and it's best when utilized with a hyper-localized product like our Snowtistics reports, which we'll have more on a little bit later on here in the webinar. So the big question is, why is a snowfall climatology important? If you're a snow and ice contractor, why would you want to get this anyway? Can't you just get stuff freely available? Well, you could. However, it's very important to get very specific with your location, with your site. Make sure that you're getting the most accurate data for your location that you will be doing contracts for. So basically, it's important because the snowfall climatology roots your snow and ice business in snowfall data. So you don't want to be guessing in any way on how much snow falls at a particular location. Otherwise, your contract could be off by thousands, even tens of thousands. So we don't want that to happen. So I think it's the best thing to root that in some factual data about the snowfall climatologies. It also protects you from extremes and year-to-year variability. It gives your contracts a good baseline when looking at your revenue, looking at your cost, and looking at your profit. And don't you want those contracts to be as good as they can be or as competitive as they can be? I mean, that's what we need here for your contracts. So more specifically, snowfall climatologies can help you create a balanced portfolio when it comes to seasonal contracts and per inch, per hour, per push contracts. It can be a resource for determining appropriate caps or floors and thresholds. It can aid in determining time and material needed. So if you're trying to estimate out how much cost you're going to spend, it can help you with that, especially with those storm counts that you can find in our Snowtistics reports, and also identify snowfall trends and even help investigate a new market. So it's not only your current sites that these can help with and your current contracts. What if you're thinking about going into a market that's 20, 25 miles away? Is it going to be profitable for your company? Is it going to make the correct revenue? So that's something we really want to, also advise. If you, let's use it as an exploratory feature here as your business grows. And we all know the snow and ice industry continues to grow, that's for sure. So here's a basic snowfall climatology example. This is just a very basic outline, just showing some yearly averages and normals and some variability too. So in general, when you're looking at snowfall climatologies, you typically want to get somewhere between a 10 to 15 year average for that particular location. In this case, we're looking at Boston. The 10 to 15 year average is somewhere around 50 inches from what it's showing there. Um, Sometimes if you get 30-year averages, it might be a little bit too smooth. So we're trying to get some of the most recent data in there. And also, you want to also look at those 3 to 5 year averages because they can be a bit different from what you're seeing in the 10 to 15 year averages. So looking quickly at this example right here, I mean, you can see that there's a pretty drastic difference between the 3 and 5 year average and the 10 to 15 year average here at Boston. Typically we're talking around 50 inches here, but this looks more like, what is that, 35 to 39 or something like that over the last 3 to 5 years. So that's something you might want to really keep in the back of your mind when you're structuring some contracts, that's for sure. And I think one of the big things too is that we have to look at extremes. So if we look at the last 30 years over on this chart from Boston, you can tell that there's so many extremes going on right here. We're talking about over 100 inches, what's that, about 110 inches, all the way down to about 10 or 12 inches in the matter of a couple of years there. So, I mean, that's a incredible spread of 100 inches, and you can't make a contract off of 110 inches because that's not going to happen every time. And you certainly can't make one off of 10 inches because that's way too low. So you have to look at that variability. And I think it's important to realize that we highlighted an area here, which is about around Boston's average. I think we have about 35 to 50 inches in this little box here. And notice there's not many times over the last 30 years that they actually fall within that average. It's only about a third of the time. So if you base your contracts just on that average, only a third of the time that happens, well, is that a very feasible contract for your company? Is that going to be the most profitable? Is that going to get you the most revenue? So you have to look outside of that a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more, Sherilyn will, on standard deviation, excuse me. And that will give you a better spread of ideas of where that average typically falls. And there we're just pointing out some of those extremes and those peaks. Boston is fairly extreme. Some other cases might be a little bit more smooth, like areas like Detroit or around the Great Lakes. So another thing we have to look at with snowfall climatologies is identifying good and bad data. So it seems that every time I go to a trade show or anytime I talk to a client, a lot of times I hear it, I've heard it a million times that, hey, it snows on one side of my service locations and it rains on the other, or one side sees a lot more snow than this side of the town. And I hear that all the time. So when you look at some freely available data, you may be 10 to 15 miles away from your actual site that you're servicing. So if you're seeing that amount of spread within your service area, why would you use that freely available data that's coming from, say, Boston Logan Airport when you're in Bedford? And that's an example I displayed right here, is that we're talking about a 14-mile difference. So this isn't very far away, the two towns from each other. But look at that normal difference. Talking about 59 inches for the normal in Bedford and only 49 inches in Boston. So that's a 10-inch spread, and that's with the normals. So if you take in any type of variability whatsoever, I mean, just looking at last year, you're talking about a 24-inch difference from Boston to Bedford. And obviously, if you are using Boston data for Bedford, that contract isn't going to be set up just quite right for you. So something to really look at. Don't use data too far away from your sites, that's for sure. And don't only look at seasonal averages, because you could see by 22-23 that there was a big difference here based on storm events and variability. So what we recommend that we do use is some high resolution snowfall climatology that's zip code based. We want it quality controlled extensively, and we do that here at WeatherWorks with our data team and our meteorologists, who are just excellent around the board. And Sherilyn can certainly attest to that, that's for sure.
Yep.
And also we want to look at those variable years and those extremes and those storm types and counts and standard deviations when we're all getting that data together for developing contracts. So I'm going to review the data usage differences a little bit per contract types. Now, this is kind of like the Cliff Notes. If you want a little bit more in-depth detail, I would suggest looking at one of our past webinars on our YouTube channel. It was called Decreasing Risk and Increasing Sustainability in the Snow and Ice Industry, where we had a guest on, Neil Glatt of Snowfighters Institute. He explains all the contract types, goes into depth about your costs, your profits, and all things of that nature, and how to best utilize that. So please check out that old webinar. That'll certainly get a lot more information. But as far as in general, there's basically three types of contracts that you guys probably deal with on a day-to-day. You're looking at the PERS, which we kind of dubbed it, and those are those per inch, per hour, per push type contracts. The seasonal contracts, and also something that's relatively new, a retainer contract. So with the PERS, this might be an instance where you want to really focus on some of the variability and extremes that you're seeing, and also look into those storm counts or types, because if you're looking at per push per se, that wasn't a joke or anything. I was just too many purrs going on there for a second. But if you're looking at those type of contracts, you're probably going to want to really realize how many 2-inch events happen, how many 6-inch events, how many 12-inch events. That way you can kind of estimate, well, is this going to be a thing where I need to pull in extra equipment? Does it happen often? How many times a year does some event that's over 6 inches happen? And I have to be prepared for that. And also the types of event, icing events, how many of those do occur? And we have a lot of information on that too, from our data team and our Snowtistics side. But that way you can kind of estimate your salting activity too. So that's something that you want to consider with those per contracts. With the seasonal, there's fixed, there's adjustable. Seasonal are just one fixed price for the season. The adjustable might have some sort of threshold before you start increasing billing or going by some per inch basis. But this is where you want to think about those averages and medians between the 10 to 15 year period. A lot of times we like to look at medians too, and Sherilyn will have more on that, because they might be a little bit more representative than the averages. And you can also get your thresholds too. And this is where the standard deviation may come into play with your contracts, because that uses a range that is about 2/3 of the data set, with the middle of that being the average. So that way you can get a reasonable low snow year and a reasonable high snow year, and you're not taking 110 versus 10 inches. So, and then also your trends you can look at, your 3 to 5 year averages. That way you can see if there's any type of trend going on over the last recent years that you might want to be aware of. And the final contract is the retainer contract, and that is basically a fixed price, non-refundable retainer, and then some type of per combination that happens with that, and that might be based on some thresholds or caps or ceilings or floors. Again, I'm not an expert on that, but um, that's the general sense of how things work. And basically, you're going to want to use almost all of the above out of the snowfall climatologies to figure out those retainer contracts and get them competitive and priced right. So, like I said before, Snowtistics provides all of this information in one convenient little package, and that's where Sherilyn's going to pick up here, explain more about what Snowtistics is, why it was developed, how it works, and a lot of the intricacies of the product. Okay, so Sherilyn, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate it. So, why was Snowtistics developed? We noticed about 10 or 15 years ago that there was a real need in the snow and ice industry to have more specific and comprehensive snow data. We had a lot of our forecast and certified snowfall total clients come to us and say, hey, we're utilizing NOAA data, but they're really only available at the nearest airport, and the nearest airport to me is 30 miles away. How can I get more representative snowfall data that's specific to, my town? And that's where we kind of came in, and we were able to utilize our certified snowfall total data to fill in those gaps. It is more heavily quality controlled thanks to our data analysts doing the certified snowfall total data. We have many locations where we have data that's zip code specific back all the way to 2005, 2006. And we've been able to reconstruct many areas of the country even further back, as far back as 30 years, thanks to our team of data analysts here in the data and statistics department. So again, it's Snowtistics is really, it's not just meant for contractors, although that was kind of the primary motivation of how we developed Snowtistics. Nowadays, even property managers are getting into the game, and they're interested in the snowfall climatologies and statistical analyses that they can get from that. So it's really about 50-50 now that's requesting our data and that utilize our Snowtistics products. And
I
it
think
really
that's an
helps.
important point you bring up there, Sherilyn, because it's not only for contractors. I know a lot of my part might have been focused on developing contracts and the benefits of that side, but if you're a property manager, this way you have an idea of what is normal, what are the normal amount of storms, so that when you get these uh, proposed contracts on your desk, you can then kind of verify with the information you have to make sure this is in the ballpark and this is somewhere that is competitive and not something that's way too low or way too high.
Correct. And, another thing that contractors and property managers have told us that they love about our Snowtistics product is that they use our certified snowfall totals for billing during the winter season. So to know that the climatological data is based off our certified snowfall totals really gives it that added bonus and bolsters on both sides in terms of trust, because we are that third party provider, giving them that zip code specific data. So how did we develop Snowtistics? Again, like I mentioned, we utilized our third-party analysis of snow and ice data through our certified snowfall totals across the country. Again, it is zip code specific, so it is specific to your given area. It's not just an airport data nearby or, even within one city. I mean, there can be varieties of snowfall. Look at New York City. So we actually go down to
Right.
the zip code and can be specific to your area.
Yeah, I want to mention too here, the certified snowfall program, that is not something that's just auto-generated from some sort of algorithm. This is actual meteorologists looking through that data, analyzing that data, looking at radar, looking at all the different observations that come in, and really coming up with the exact numbers for zip codes that are most representative. So please know that that is one of our best products that we have here um, with snow and ice data.
Exactly. So I also mentioned before that, we have CST data back to 0506 for many locations. And for us to go further back, we did need to dig through that climatological NOAA data for you. So we had our wonderful team of data analysts do that, and they were able to reconstruct 20, 25, 30 years for almost any given location, utilizing both our certified snowfall data and quality controlling that NOAA data for you, to make sure that we keep everything as site specific as possible. On top of snowfall data, we also have a climatology back 15 years for ice data. Ice is becoming ever since I feel like 2017, it's become a tricky um, uh, storm type for both contractors and property managers to deal with. Ice is not easy. You could get a tenth of an inch of ice and it's the equivalent of, practically 10 inches of snow, or 1 inch of snow or something like that in terms of like kind of work effort. Because you have to come back, and depending on how long the freezing rain lasts, it's multiple de-icers. And then before you know it, that de-icer is diluted and you got to treat it again before it so it really is a challenging precipitation type, and both sides are realizing that, and they're digging into that kind of ice data to figure out how can we appropriately bill for this. What is an appropriate amount of work for this to make sure that we can recoup costs? Because if you're a per inch contract and you can only bill point 0.1 of ice, I mean,
Mm,
point one of snow is nothing to these guys. Point one of ice is a whole different ball game.
absolutely.
So it's certainly useful to take a look at that kind of data to figure out how often it happens in your area, and how to contend with it going into a new winter season. What new stuff is coming to Snowtistics? Our data and stats team is continually expanding the database. Like I said, at most, I would say almost all areas of the country have at least 20 years of snow and 15 years of ice. We do have a lot of locations that have 25, 30 years of data, but we're continually expanding that. So we're working through that across the country. And then we're also increasing the resolution across the country, in terms of that specific snow and ice data for, essentially longevity. So you can use all that snow and ice data to help you build your contracts. So I wanted to go through some examples of our Snowtistics products and essentially what you'll be looking at. Snowtistics has a combination of charts and graphics to really help you like kind of zone in, and be able to look at the monthly and the seasonal data, season by season, as well as kind of be able to look at it in terms of a graphical representation that you can even input into your contracts. You can attach these to your contracts. You can input these into presentations that you're providing to your clients. And they're really useful. And there's a number of areas that you should be looking at when you do order a Snowtistics with us. So of course, there's the raw data that's broken down by month as well as season, which is really nice if you're specifically looking at a given season and looking at the variabilities between them. And then also there tends to be a bunch of averages. So we mentioned the 5, the 10, the 15 year, particularly the volatility of seasons, especially in the last 5 years in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. We've had 2 winter seasons that were well below average. That is lowering that 5-year average. But on top of averages, you really also want to focus in on medians. Medians are important because an average is just that. It's an average. So you could have a bunch of 10-inch seasons, a bunch of 30-inch seasons, but then when you calculate the average, it winds up being around 20 inches, but you never actually see 20 inches. So how is a median different? A median is if you take for whatever period of record you have and you take the actual seasonal totals and order them up from minimum to maximum. Then you take that middle amount that's in that kind of data set. So you're actually looking at an actual snowfall total that happens in the middle of the data set. That is what the median is. And sometimes it can be close to the average. In this case, in Boston, it looks like, the 15-year average was 53.2, and then the 15-year median was 54. So relatively close. But again,
Mm.
you can have some data sets that wind up being very different in terms of averages and medians. I've seen 10 or 15 inches difference between an
Wow.
average and a median. Um, Particularly when you're looking at essentially a smaller data set, it tends to be more dramatic. When you look at a bigger data set, you don't see as much variability, kind of like a 15-year here for Boston.
Mhm.
But it is important to take a look at that number and kind of maybe lean more toward the median, to be honest, when constructing your contracts over averages. So one of the contract types that Mike mentioned had to do with seasonal contracts, and some of them are fixed, some of them are adjustable. And those adjustables, we've noticed in the last few years, the trend has been putting in caps and floors. So having kind of like a bottom tier and upper tier, and most of the time, ideally the seasonal total falls within that amount, so that you have a guaranteed revenue stream as a contractor, and a property manager also knows how much they're paying per season. But if the snowfall amount falls below that kind of floor, then the contractor may have to issue a refund back to the property manager, and then vice versa. If it winds up being higher and above that cap, then the property manager needs to pay out more to the contractor. So how do you determine those kind of caps and floors? How do you even construct something like that? We highly recommend standard deviation in order to help you construct those. So again, an average is kind of like middle of the line. It may not be completely representative of season to season, particularly in Boston. It was back in the 14-15 season. You guys had 112, 113 inches. But then just recently, you guys only got 18 inches. And even back in 2011, 2012, it was as low as 12 or 13 inches. So you're talking about 100-inch variability just in the last 15 years. So in order to kind of like center in and figure out where do most seasons wind up falling into, standard deviation is your statistic. And standard deviation essentially indicates where 2/3 of the data typically falls within. So the average is usually somewhere in the middle of that standard deviation, and then 2/3 of that data is going to fall either above or below that average and be within that 2/3. And as you can see here in like the 15-year, it looks like there's only about 3 seasons in the last 15 years that fell below the standard deviation, and about 1 or 2 that fell above. And that for 15 years, that's exactly it. 10 out of those 15 seasons are going to fall within your standard deviation, and 5 are going to be either above or below. Another thing is event breakdowns, being able to see how many events are dusting events, 1 to 2 inch events, your salting events, 2 to 6 inch events, your typical plowing events, significant events, 6+, where you may have to break out a little bit more of the heavy machinery, and then certainly those foot+ events where you're really breaking out, the heavy equipment, in order to move that snow and get it off the property, because just pushing it is not going to, really help you at that point. I'm sure, Mike, you remember that in the 2014-2015 season. I think that snow pile in Boston lasted until
Yeah, I think it
July.
was like, yeah, it might have been July. I was gonna say June, but that's probably too early. But
Contractors ran out of room.
yeah,
They had to put it somewhere.
if anybody's from New England during that time, I remember hearing the stories of that. Just the piles on the sides of the roads were up to the height of their truck,
Right.
not the ones that they're really piling up in a parking lot or something like that, which is pretty amazing to me.
Yeah.
But that's something else.
Exactly. So on top of figuring out how often certain like inch events happen, we also have a snow and ice breakdown. So we can show you how often snow events happen versus mixed events like the snow and ice combination, as well as just freezing rain, ice only events. And again, very helpful for your contract, particularly when it comes to sleet, and it comes to ice from freezing rain. If you don't have those snowfall inches to bill against it, you may be doing more work than you're actually getting revenue from. So being able to account for those in your contract, if mixed events and ice events are common in your market, can be super helpful.
And don't forget too, there are the monthly totals that are broken out here too, so you can see which months are the most heavy for your season, and the spread there too. You can also see that deviation bar in gray, so you can kind of have an idea of what your top and what your bottom is during those snowy months too.
Exactly. And, Boston tends to get most of their snow in January and February. So, how much data should you analyze? We have a lot of clients come to us that are like, I want the 30-year data. And we often go to them, are you sure? Because it is a lot of data to analyze. And as Mike alluded to in the beginning of this webinar, the 30 years tends to smooth everything out. So you don't get to see that recent variability from the last 5, 10, 15 years that's really impacting your business. If you think about it, 30-year data, you're talking about the 90s. Uh,
Mm,
a lot has changed since the 90s.
a little different.
So, while we don't want to discount the 30-year, and in your Snowtistics report, oftentimes we will put in the 30-year standard for you to compare the most recent seasons to. We actually do recommend looking more so nowadays at the 10 or 15-year climatology. We looked in the beginning of this webinar, Boston, the 5-year average was like 35, 40 inches. But the 10 or 15 is closer toward like that 50 mark. So again, because property managers are also getting into the game, you may not want to use that 5-year average because it's skewed very low because we've had 2 low winter seasons in the last 5 years. And again, there tends to be seasonality. Oftentimes when we have a bunch of low seasons, all of a sudden we get hit with a high season. And property managers are going to be looking at that. So we do recommend utilizing that 10 and 15-year climatology to realize that, okay, we had 2 low seasons in the last 5 years. The last time we really had anything like that was back in 2011, 2012. But also look at the high seasons we had in 2013 and 2014. You want to be able to account for both your minimums, your maximums, and where snowfall averages tend to fall into in the rest of those 10 and 15 years. So certainly make sure when you are requesting climatology data, you're looking more at that 10 and 15-year as opposed to a 5-year. It's going to be too skewed, too low, or a 30-year that's going to be smoothed out and winds up being too average for you. So what else can you do with this data? Obviously understanding averages and understanding trends, that's a great first step. Realizing that, snowfall seasons don't always fall within that average. You're going to have extremes either below or above. So coming armed with that data when you're going forward with your customer is that finishing touch. It really gives you that upper edge to say, hey, I understand this industry. I understand the variability of snowfall. And here's the data to go with it that's specific to your property. It really does give you that added edge, really, when you're constructing a contract with a customer. You can show them the wide range of possibilities. There could be 100-inch difference in Boston, but what's the normal? Look at that standard deviation. Where do 2/3 of those snowfall seasons typically fall into? And then balance those winners and losers. So some seasons you may get 10 inches, some seasons you may get 110 inches. How do you minimize risk for that? So adding sometimes caps and refunds into a seasonal contract can help balance it for both contractors and property managers. And I think another thing is too, is that in the snow and ice industry, it's a long game. You don't want to be in it just for one season and expecting, massive profits every year. You want to prepare for that variability and you want to be ready for, okay, we made profits, during this winter season where we had 110 inches. Now we're going to construct our contracts and be prepared for that 10-inch event next year, retain a lot of those profits you had from a previous season to prepare for a potential low season. So that's why climatologies come in handy, because you can see what the trends wind up being, you can see where your minimums and maximums wind up being, and you can prepare year to year to account for that kind of variability. So regardless of the amount of snowfall that happens, you want to make sure that you kind of account for your costs. So a lot of that can be fixed costs, whether it's retaining your office and paying rent for that, maintaining salaries for your full-time employees, equipment that you have on hand year round, as well as your variable costs. Once you're getting going in that winter season, you may have overtime, you may have those 72-hour storms, fuel. Gas is up,
Hmm.
and it goes up and down. I've noticed it's been going up with Memorial Day weekend coming up, or it just happened.
Yeah.
Um, I'm losing track of my weekends.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
okay. But Sherilyn brings up a good point about your fixed costs, because that's where a lot of contractors like to balance their portfolio, where they want to have seasonal contracts that basically cover those fixed costs. And then they have maybe per inch contracts, which can cover some of that overtime or the variable costs there, and bring up profits a little bit. So definitely a good thing to have on at least in the back of your mind when you're developing those contracts and your different types of contracts for your clients. So Sherilyn, let's skip on over to event frequency and magnitude. Let's go over that a little bit for our clients.
Yeah, of course. So, kind of like I mentioned before, it's important to realize how many different types of events you have within a winter season. You could have, and your average is 50 inches, but is that two big storms, five
Hmm.
medium-sized storms, 10 small storms that add up to it? That's where you kind of want to dive deep and look at your coding events, look at your less than an inch, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, et cetera, et cetera. That can help you essentially better budget, knowing that if you have a mix, let's say, of seasonal and per inch contracts, what you're getting yourself into, so you can account for paying your base costs, and ideally, getting a profit for your winter season if you're a snow and ice contractor, and vice versa, making sure that you're able to save money as a property manager.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's not something that's rare to get these extreme events. They've been happening, quite frequently at times. Just look at a place like Allentown. I think one of the years there might have been about 6 or 7 inches of snow, and then they got 30 in Allentown, PA, in one storm. So all of a sudden, you're right near average, but that came very differently, and that's why it's important to look at those magnitude of events.
Exactly. And even for ice events too. The nice part of our Snowtistics is that we break it out for you. We show you how often ice events happen versus snow events. And what kind of magnitudes are you looking at when you have ice events? So taking a look at those can help you add those into your contracts and account for ice only events.
All right, thanks a lot, Sherilyn, for giving us that really in-depth breakdown of Snowtistics reports and what is all included and what the benefits are. We just want to wrap up the webinar here with, again, why do you need a product like Snowtistics and Snow Climatologies? Again, it's a baseline or starting point for all types of snow removal contracts, not just one kind. It works for every single one. It's more accurate, there's higher resolution than some of the freely available data out there. It helps you stay competitive. We know the snow and ice market continues to expand. If you've gone to the SIMA symposium, you know that show has expanded over the last 26 years greatly. So you want to stay competitive, but on the property management side, you want to also verify these contracts, making sure they're fairly priced. And even on the weather risk side, you want to quantify your risk during the winter season for some of the risk managers out there. So that pretty much wraps it up, but I want to remind everybody to visit us at the SIMA Snow and Ice Symposium. That's in Hartford, Connecticut this year, at the Connecticut Convention Center from June 13th through the 16th. If you have more questions about Snowtistics and snowfall climatologies or any of our products, please stop by the booth. It's 724, and we'll be happy to answer those questions. I believe meteorologist Rob Reel will be there, and he is really into the latest variability with lean winters, especially here in the Northeast. So he can certainly speak more on snowfall climatologies, and we'll also have those sponsored events at the welcome reception and the snack and chat. So please visit the SIMA Symposium. It's a great show, a lot more there each year, which is great. As far as our webinar, that's about it. Thank you, Sherilyn, for being with us and going in depth on the Snowtistics for us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. And again, we are here for you. WeatherWorksInc.com is where you can find our website about everything that we do here as a company. And also, don't be afraid to email data@weatherworksinc.com for any questions you may have about snowfall climatologies and snowtistics. And as always, follow us on social media at all of those platforms you see there below. So thanks for being here at the webinar. We'll see you again in a few months.